Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast.
Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast. I am Ryan Dearbone, and today I am joined by Richard Samuels, the owner of Pro Audio and Visual Professionals out of Franklin, Kentucky. Richard, it's great to have you here on the podcast and to be able to spend a little bit of time with you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you reaching out. Thank you so much.
So now we were talking a little bit before we started the podcast, and before we kind of go into how the pandemic kind of changed and altered your world, talk a little bit about your company. What do you do, and kind of how it started, I guess, pre-pandemic? What was it looking like before the pandemic kind of exploded the work that you do?
Okay, well, what we do is install pro audio and video, and it's always been mostly in churches. There are some businesses and small businesses that we install in, but we put in anything from TVs to projectors, LED screens, LED walls, full sound systems, live streaming, software, live streaming equipment, just the full works to have a full ministry, as far as audio and video ministry. And so before the pandemic, we, like I said, we always did these installs. Wasn't a whole lot, because there wasn't a lot of churches that, some were starting to add the TV screens and that software, wanting to be able to show the lyrics, wanting to be able to show the scripture. That was really spreading throughout a lot of the churches. But it wasn't a whole lot at that time. It was, just a few churches here or there, and then we would pick up some that would go into other churches and see, would see a setup and say, hey, who did that setup, and we would like that. So it was. I really think before the pandemic, I really think it was for show. A lot of that was for show. And I won't say every church, but there was a lot of churches that wanted all the bells and whistles, and they thought that would draw people in to see the screens, the cameras, everything that's going on the side.
It wasn't practical use. It was more. It was more theatrics.
It was more theatrical. Yes, and even the way it was, as far as the way it was implemented into the services, everything was pretty routine. Nothing was just kind of spare fly the service. Everything was just routine. And so I think before the pandemic, it was a little bit more, one church would see it in another church and say, hey, they got something new, we want that. And really not knowing how it could thrust their ministry, into that virtual world.
And so now when the pandemic hits, is it an immediate thing where people start reaching out to you and saying, hey, we need to start implementing this stuff in our church? Or was it kind of a slow burn where it still kind of took people a little while, pastors or churches, to decide that they needed to make this transition into a more virtual space?
Well, it was kind of immediate, because people weren't for sure, and pastors weren't for sure how they were gonna, they were shutting the churches down. So you had to have some type of way to go virtual. A lot of the pastors and churches had like Facebook, but they didn't know how to go live, say, on Facebook for a service that would reach the masses. And so one of the very first things that we would do, we would go into during the pandemic, we would go inside pastors' homes, set up a virtual setup in their house and stream that service. We would record it. So we would record that service for that pastor. Say we had maybe 10 or 12 pastors that we went into their homes and pre-recorded their service for Sunday, and then we uploaded those services on Sunday. So they could, their members could tap in on their time and see. So as that started, and so that was one of the first things, hey, because it wasn't no meetings at churches. Then I had some pastors that say, hey, can I do my service from the pulpit if it's just you and I, maybe one of my deacons? in the church, because there were so many rules, during the pandemic, like you can't have this many people, you can't, and at one time, they didn't want any gatherings into the church for weeks at a time. So we would do that. We would go into the churches and we would record the services, or sometimes we would even go live, from the churches in the service, but with our own personal setups. I think once the pastors started to realize, hey, we can get this as a permanent setup, and we started to have that dialogue of, hey, we can set up, some streaming cameras and things, and you can come in, you can have your staff or personnel come in and you can record, or you can go live, we'll train and everything. And then once that happened, it was like, okay, this is the way to go. This, and I think the most feedback that I got from the pastors was they wanted to do it so they didn't get caught in this situation again, to where if there was another pandemic that hit as big and as global as this did, then it did not cripple the church from being able to reach out, to the members and beyond. So that's kind of what thrusted it into it.
And so as this is starting to take place, I would imagine you're also walking pastors and church members through how to make a service, not so much alter your service, but to make your service more visual friendly for the online audience. Because, as we're going through this, there are certain things that you do inside the sanctuary that are done a certain way, certain rituals, certain things that you think about that are done a particular way. But now with cameras added in, with more emphasis on audio, like even, for example, I can think of my church, there'd be times where you wouldn't necessarily use a microphone because everybody in the sanctuary can hear you. But without that microphone, you have nothing but dead air to people live streaming. So I can imagine there was a level of education where you had to teach these pastors how to, or church members, how to make their service function on both a in-house, everybody in the sanctuary type feel, if there's anybody in there, as well as for a virtual audience.
That's very true. And that has been one of the biggest challenges as far as implementing churches over to this, because even though I consider these setups that we install to be pretty user-friendly, there's still a learning curve, to it. And here's the big thing. A lot of churches don't have members or personnel that are tech savvy enough to handle this kind of change. And so what we would run into a lot is we would get a church and they would say, hey, our deacons are gonna learn how to run this. And it would be 5 or 6 deacons, 60 plus years old. And no disrespect, because anybody with a willingness to learn can learn. So, but we would get deacons, up in age that really were afraid of technology and never used a computer, or, would still have an older phone, like a flip phone, instead of an iPhone or one of the Android phones. And so it created a challenge trying to get people trained enough, even just for the basics. So what we did, we always encourage the churches to implement the youth, even as early as 9 years old, because when it comes to this type of technology, the youth pick it up. It's what they do. They stay on phones and tablets all day, so it's easy for the youth to pick it up. But what we also did, and this is something that my wife got me to start, that came out to be the biggest help, because we were installing so many churches. Last year we did 26 churches. We are in, what are we in now? October, and we have done 19 churches this year.
Wow.
So, and I still have 5 more on the calendar to finish before the end of the year. So, So it's we've been busy, as far as getting these jobs, and it's, like I said, it's been a blessing. But one of the things as I grew, because, you know, I started this, my son works with me, and then I have another guy out of Nashville, Tennessee that pretty good works with. So it's just three of us. Now keep in mind, it's three of us, and we're doing these installs. One of the biggest things I prided myself on was training people and making sure that they had the proper training, the basic, to the best that they could. Because when you order from a big company, like in that, and you know, per se, if you go to one of the big pro audio companies, they're going to come in, they're going to install it, they're going to leave. If you have a problem with a piece of gear or equipment, they're going to say, well, who made that gear? Who is it by? Well, you need to call their technician. You know, that's what they do. And so one of the biggest things that I stood on is, if you call me, I will answer that phone and I will walk you through your issue. So when I got so many churches that had so many people that I couldn't get back and forth to every church, you know, I was just stretched so thin, had my son going different churches and places. But when I did get to a point of where I couldn't reach everybody, my wife said, why don't you start a Zoom for all the church engineers? And I was like, what? And she was like, start a Zoom meeting, have it on a certain night, all the church engineers can chime in, and then any questions that they have, they can, you know, ask them some other people's questions and probably be answered, you know, before they even get a chance to ask a question. And that was one of the greatest ideas that could have ever happened. So I started a Zoom meeting, do it on Thursday nights. I call it Iron Sharpens Iron. And so what we do, like I said, all the churches that I've installed, those engineers and people that's trained there, they can log into the Zoom, and they questions from Sunday, they'll say, hey, we had this happen, or, you know, we want to do this. How do we navigate and go through this? And then I could go through it, you know, from here in my studio, from the Zoom, and be able to go through it. And it made it to where it made my job easy, because somebody will ask a question and I'll answer it. And then 6 other people say, man, that was the same question we had, you know, and then so different ways to do things. And like you were talking about, setting up the service, the flow of it, and the way things are, and how routine things are, certain times and certain, you know, how our tithes and offerings and things like that, being able to implement that into the virtual as well as in person, and not make it a distraction to in-person service, you know, but make it so pleasing to the virtual that, you know, okay, they can see this information, take it down easily, you know, not anything they don't have to fumble with. You know, now it's easy as scanning a QR code off the computer, you know, that churches will pop up for their tithes, a QR code. You can take your phone and scan that code right off the screen and tie it that way, you know. So implementing all of that in, it was like, for me, it's easy. I can do it in my sleep. But for some of these churches not to have personnel and staff that are that tech savvy, the virtual, the Zoom meeting has made it a little bit easier, you know, for me to navigate that, for me to walk these churches through that, because I can just get everybody together collectively and, hey, you know, somebody have a question, and then we'll go through the basics. Hey, this is how you do this. If you want to do this way, if you want to add this. And it made life so much easier. I don't even know how I can thank her, repay her for that, because that was a major piece of what we do to change the game on how we do things.
That just seems like it allows for people who are hesitant about making that changeover, gives them some comfort to know that they're not going to be just left alone. And it's like you said, install and go, but they're going to have somebody to be with them throughout, because technology, as great as it is technology. Whether it's a glitch that you don't anticipate on Sunday morning, which I've been there, I've had that happen many times, or it's one of those things where you're still trying to figure it out, but having somebody there who can say, okay, this is what I've seen, this is what I know, this is how it works, has got to be a calming piece for for those churches, knowing that they are not out there on an island by themselves?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that when I sit down with the churches for the meetings, and they'll say, "Oh, so we're gonna have access, you know, we're gonna have access to that and access to you and be able to," and it gives them a peace of mind, to know that if they have an issue. And the biggest thing about it is a lot of these churches talk to each other, from my area to, where I live in Kentucky to Indiana to Tennessee, all this, and we've done installs everywhere. I actually did an install in Vegas.
Wow. Wow.
Went to Vegas for our anniversary. Actually, I went out on my birthday and left a card, critiqued the guy at a Motown show, kind of critiqued his audio and video, left the card, and he wound up calling me back saying, hey, can you come out and, everything we talked about, I want to do it. And but things like, just having that peace of mind, knowing that if we have some problems, you're always my Sundays start at 5 a.m. And I bet throughout Sunday, I talk to at least 15 churches every Sunday.
Wow.
Because there is hey, we want to do this. How do we do this? And the biggest thing I try to get them to do is, if there's an issue or if there's something wrong, please, if your service starts at 11, your media and video personnel need to be there at probably 9 o'clock, 2 hours before, going through your checks, going through your setups, checking everything. So that way, if it takes you an hour to go through your checks, now you got another hour if we have an issue that you can reach out to me and I can say, hey, here's what you need to do. If your service starts at 11 and you call me at 10:50, it makes it a lot more difficult, So I have some churches that will make that early call, and I get phone calls over simple stuff, so that's the thing about not having personnel that, are really engineers and things like that. Stuff that we go over, stuff that we, even on the Zoom, and I'll get phone calls and I try to answer every one of them, they'll say, hey, we're trying to do this, we can't do this. And I'll say, hey, remember, and they'll, oh, yeah, got it. And that's the end of that call. Just a trigger for them to remember something. So it definitely has its ups and downs. But it's, for the most part, it's been about everything I thought it would be, and probably a little more than I thought it would be. Yeah.
Nice. So now, changing gears just a little bit. So you had mentioned before we started that you had a lot of pastors that were concerned that by making this move, it might inhibit people from coming back into the sanctuary once the pandemic, obviously we didn't know how long the pandemic would last, but once the pandemic was over or things leveled out, that people were going to be less inclined to come back in because their new behavior is to watch church online virtually and not be as inside the sanctuary. Can you talk a little bit about, that circumstance, what you heard and what you've seen happen?
Yeah, that was the biggest pushback from a lot of the pastors when we first started doing the installs. And this was in the pandemic, but coming off of where we could, have services, have few of the services, masks and different things. And that was the biggest pushback from some of the pastors was, if people start to watch this virtually on the live, then they will become complacent and want to watch it from home instead of coming into the sanctuary. And the pandemic would give them an excuse not to come back into church once the green light was given for people to come back into church. And so that was probably the biggest, like I said, pushback that we would get from pastors. Hey, I'm worried that, I'm going to lose my in-house members and they're not going to come. But I think what would happen and the thing that kind of overshadowed that, there was churches that maybe had 60, 70, 80 members, maybe some of them had 150 members. But then when they went virtual, they had 1,000 people watching their service. Or they would have 5,500 views before the following Sunday. And I think some of these churches being able to reach that many people, it made them say, we can't go back. Because we're able to reach so many people that we would never have been able. I'm talking about different countries, different places. So that alone, when churches started to see, and even some churches were already live streaming, some churches were doing like their phones and Facebook, and they had services where they would run off their phones and Facebook. But when we actually came in with the cameras and set everything up to where, the service, it was like you were actually in the service, their live stream audience skyrocketed to a point of where I would have pastors call me and say, hey, I had over 1,000 people look at my service in 2 days. And the great thing about that is that through the social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and some of the streaming platforms, it gives you analytics. So you can see who watched, you can't see names, but it'll show you like age, demographic, age groups, how many people logged on in a certain age group, how long they watched, what was the most watched part of the service, things like that. It'll give you those analytics. So when I implemented that to the pastor, say, hey, look, here's how you see your analytics. Print this off, and you have your secretary or somebody print this off, and now you can see what audience you're reaching. You can see the most part of what service they watch. You can say, it'll say at an hour and 15 minutes into this service, you had 900 people on the line. And for how long? So and then he can go back and look and say, okay, that was when I was in my teaching room and on this topic, and kind of compare from week to week what they're teaching and see how it was reaching the people. And so that made them a little bit more comfortable on, okay, if people don't come back in the sanctuary, I'm reaching so many people that I would never be able to reach if I did not have this type of setup to be able to reach people. And so it eased a lot of the pastor's mind, but then also, the church lives by tithe and offering. And so that was another challenge. People aren't coming to church, they're not going to tithe. And that's when, the virtual Cash App, Givelify, Tithely, things like that. So we started putting that in for churches and setting that up to where they could tithe online, people could tithe online. And once they saw that, then they were all in, okay, now we got people that don't even go to our church and they tithe in here every Sunday. People would see a service from, say somebody was watching from Florida and they say, hey, I saw your service, great message, Pastor, and I just sent a love offering, through Cash App to the church. And it happened. And still, I still go to churches today and they'll say, man, we got people, audiences watching from everywhere, different countries, everywhere. And so they love that reach that it had, that they would never have gotten if it was in-person service.
And so kind of based off of that, how do you see how the scope of church changes? Because it goes from wherever you're at, being in with the church that you have, you hear your sermon because you're at that church. If you don't go to another church, you don't know what the other preacher's preaching. But now your service for your church is global now. Or let's say you live in a small town or big city, whatever, you can watch multiple services from multiple churches in that same town and not have to choose, well, I can only go to one church at one time. And if I don't go to a certain church, I'm going to miss something. How do you think that changes the scope of religion and churches and what they're doing?
Well, I mean, I think I think the change was great because it allows people to hear pastors preach that never would have got to hear preach. You know, it allows you to watch a service that, you know, a lot of times we would feel guilty about going to another church. You know, even if they were having a service, oh man, I want to go to this service, but we're having service. You know, they're having a homecoming or they're having a, you know, friends and family day, and I want to go, but we're having a service. So I don't want to, because now where churches used to do, the second service used to be afternoon services. Now churches are getting away from that, and they're doing morning service only when they invite these other churches in. So, but by having it virtual and by it being recorded, I can just, once I leave my service, I can go right home or wherever I choose and watch that service. You know, so I can watch it in its entirety. And I think it's a little more for me when I get home. I never get to, if I run audio at a service, I never get to enjoy the service. I never get to be a part of the service. If I'm running sound and video, there's so much going on that I never get to be a part of the service. So even when the service starts, I'm still checking live stream, got this going on, making sure this is right. Okay, what's up next? This needs to be on the screen. This visual needs to be here. And even though I have people that do that, I can't focus because I got to make sure I'm looking, hey, this, you know, okay, yeah, they got that. Okay, that, you know. So for me, I watch a lot of services at the end of my day. And I'll come home, once I'm relaxed, I'll get in the bedroom and I can cast to my big TV in the bedroom, and I can just, and a lot of times I don't watch the full service. I'll hit a couple of songs because I wanted to hear how it sounded, and then I'll go straight to the service, and I will listen to the service, you know, to the sermon on a lot of them preachers that I wanted to hear. Some of these installs I've done in Indiana, and different places, those pastors I've never heard. You know, those pastors I never heard preach. So I was able to come back and connect with that. Okay, now I can see that service. So that's been the greatest thing, even locally, that it allows me to not have to feel guilty about if I wanted to miss a service, because, and it's really nothing like being there in person. But I think when I watch it from home, for me, it's more intimate to me because I don't have all the distractions from being in the sanctuary. So I can watch the service and I can fully be locked into it. And for example, yesterday I had to go to Lexington, Kentucky. We just finished the install in Russellville, Kentucky. And they had their first service with their new system. On the way to Lexington, I listened to the service, you know, from Russellville. I wanted to hear it. So my wife and I were riding, and as we were riding, we got so locked up into, you know, listening to the service, the sermon, like, you know, we made a 2.5 hour drive, and for an hour and 45 minutes, we never said a word, you know, each other, because we were locked into listening to the service. So that's the intimacy of being able to see a service like that, or, you know, or even listen to it like that, just because I had it hooked to the car audio. So I think it's more intimate that way for me. You know, now if I told some of the pastors that, they probably freak out. You know?
Yeah.
No, we want as many bodies in here as we can get in here. But yeah, I think that was great. That's great, being able to come back and look at the pastors here, that even in the town that I live in, we have a small town, and we have, if I'm not mistaken, there's nine African American churches. 9 in this small town. And there's 9 African American churches here, and there may be 1,000 people of color in this town out of 20+ thousand people. There may be 1,000 people of color. And it's 9. And the churches are all grouped and everything, but people don't get to. This church has their members, this church has their members, and even though sometimes, like you said, you want to hear this other pastor preach, you know, you want to hear him speak, so that just opened the door to say, okay, I still can hear that. Or if I miss my service today, guess what? I still can go back and catch my service. So you can visit that other church, and then you still can come back and catch your service too as well. So yeah, that really changed the way people view it. And you know, I know a lot of pastors probably wouldn't like that when you talk about members going to other services, but for me, it is all about the ministry. As long as you're going to hear the word, you know, it's the ministry, man, and that's why I love what I do. You know, I tell people I get paid for what I do, but you know, it's definitely a ministry for me. It's ministry first, and you know, I try to tell the pastors, be careful who you put in charge. You know, once you have these setups, once you change over to this, be careful who you allow to run these ministries, because you can. There's a lot of good that you can do if it's ran correctly, but also there's a lot of damage that can be done to the kingdom if it's not ran correctly. And you know, we have different things going in churches. We were talking a little earlier about certain parts of service, like when somebody goes to the chair for altar call or confession. I always tell people, never ever put somebody's altar call or confession or going to the chair over the live stream. And
Right.
and I because I think that's a private moment for the church itself. So I always have churches cut away and go to, you know, maybe church information slides or the upcoming information on the live while that's going on. Because if that's the good and the bad of church, that information, if I'm giving a testimony and somebody comes in online on the end of that testimony, and I might have said something about being on drugs 1,000 years ago before, and then all somebody's gonna hear is, oh, Brother Samuel said he's on drugs. I see it on the live stream.
Right.
So that's the good and the bad about you know, being able to process that information so quickly. But there are certain parts of the service that I tell the churches, hey, you can do it how you want. I'm not going to tell you how to run it, but my recommendation would be any intimate part of your service, not to have it broadcast across the live stream.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So now, looking forward, do you see churches, I guess, ask it this way. Do you see churches looking for additional like upgrades? They'll continue to upgrade more. They'll continue to find, hey, this audio and video equipment is great for now, but eventually we want to do more. And then to piggyback off of that, do you think at any point that having so many virtual churches or virtual elements will eventually start closing the doors of brick and mortar churches as they maybe transition into a more virtual landscape because of maybe cost effectiveness, because of maybe not having as many physical bodies as they used to? Do you see that as a transition that may eventually happen?
Well, as far as, you know, the churches like continuing or coming back and continue to upgrade, but technology changes so much that there's always going to be a more efficient way sometimes. I don't recommend the upgrades unless it is I tell people, if it will 50% change the way you do things at church, then let's make that change. If it's a small change and a small thing, the way it's gonna, you know, if it's not gonna enhance what you do at least 50%, then let's not make that change. But with that being said, there will always be, technology just changes so much. There's always going to be a better way to do this. Or hey, they came out, for instance, like the software that the main house of worship software. I don't care if you're in a small church or if you're in a mega church. Software called ProPresenter, and that's the software that runs everything. It runs the video. You run the audio through it off the mixer. It runs the lighting. You know, if you're controlling the lighting in the house, it controls the lighting and everything. So that software gave smaller churches a chance to have setups like bigger churches, but on a smaller scale. So what I encourage churches when I install, a lot of times smaller churches will say, hey, can we just add this right now and do this? And I always encourage them, do the most that you can up front, and it will save you in the long run. Don't cut corners up front. You know, if you can stand it, then do it. If you can't stand it, then don't do it. But I even tell them, and I had a church that we did an install for in Clarksville, Tennessee. They did a pretty big install upgrade, and I told them before we did it, they said, well, we want to add this, but we want to come back and do it at this time. We want to do it. And I said, well, why don't you do this? Save up for what you want, and then when you're ready to do it, let's do it. Because one part needs the other part, and this part needs this part. And so we can't add this part without, and it'd be great without having the next part. And that's what they did. So it took them about a year. And then they had an instance where last December, when we had the sub-zero weather here, their church flooded, pipes burst, church flooded. And it pretty much destroyed their sanctuary. They had to completely remodel everything in the sanctuary. So that was their moment along with everything else. And I think altogether they probably did maybe, I don't know, a little over $250,000 upgrade on the sanctuary and the sound and video. So they did a pretty decent size upgrade for their church. You know, a lot of our churches, you talk about spending $250,000, they're like, yeah, on some sound and video, they're like, what, we're gonna do what? We're gonna
right.
But I encourage churches to do the most that you can up front. And if you can't, if you have a visual, and I sit down because what I do, I sit down with the church, with the pastors, the deacons, whatever members that they put together, and I say, what is your visual for where you want your church to go? What are you trying to achieve out of this ministry? And once we get that set, and then I tell them, here's what it's going to take for what you want to do. If they, and here's the cost, here's what this is going to cost all the way through. Now, if they say, well, like I said, we want to do this now and do that, then I encourage, let's wait. I know you want it now, but let's wait until there is a threshold that certain things that you have to have because one working part needs the next part. So let's wait until we're ready to get in right where we need to be. And then let's come back and do it. And a lot of churches buy into that, say, okay, and they're glad that they did because, once we go to the pot and in our churches, once we go to the pot and say, hey, we want to make these upgrades, this is going to cost us, and most of the small churches around here, I'll say an average, $40,000-$50,000 just audio and video upgrade. And that's decent for smaller churches. We're talking smaller churches, maybe 100 members. Some of them maybe have 150, so that's a pretty decent upgrade, for a smaller church.
Wow.
Just from the tech side, from the virtual side of it.
Wow. Well, Richard, I appreciate your time. We've been talking with Richard Samuels, who is the owner of Pro Audio Visual Professionals in Franklin, Kentucky. It was great talking to you and kind of learning a little bit more about it from your end, because you have a unique perspective that the rest of us don't see, because you install this and you've seen this in multiple churches and how it's kind of changed the landscape. So I appreciate your time, Richard. You can learn more about Richard Samuels and his business, Pro Audio and Video Professionals, by calling them at 270-586-1220 or by emailing Richard at richardsamuels@proaudioandvideoprofessionals.com. We thank you for listening to this episode of Church with No Walls. Take care and be blessed.